Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Aishika Bhattacharya and I'll be your moderator for the session. Today we are presenting Effective Change Management in P2P by Pete Blocklin. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. At any point in time, if you have any questions, you may send us those in the Q&A box and they will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. Introducing Zycus. Zycus is a global provider of complete source-to-pay suite of procurement performance solutions. Our comprehensive product portfolio includes applications for both the strategic and the operational aspects of procurement. Zycus has been recognized as a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for strategic sourcing application suites for 3 years in a row. Today we have with us Pete, who has over 2 decades of experience developing and implementing purchase-to-pay strategies for some of the largest companies in the world. He has worked across a range of industries, including financial services, IT, health, energy, and manufacturing. He regularly publishes thought leadership pieces in the Purchasing Insight blog and is a sought-after speaker at industry conferences, where he shares his passion for P2P across its whole spectrum, from sourcing and procurement to accounts payable and supply chain finance. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to Pete.
Thank you, and let me add my welcome to everybody. Let me just describe what I'd like to talk us through today on the subject of change management in purchase to pay. First of all, I'd like to look at the change management challenge. Why is change management an issue? We'll also talk a little bit about cloud and the compromises that have to be made, the disadvantages and advantages of using the cloud, and how to turn challenges into opportunities. I want to share with you some examples which I think are very useful that we can learn from at times when the world changed in a permanent way, and I think there are some lessons to be learned from that for us. And then look at some specific types of change, the types of real-world change issues that we'll confront in the context of purchase to pay. And importantly, how to think differently. Coping with change is about thinking in different ways. And then I'll finish with some of my top tips for effective change management. So what I'd like to do first of all is to tell a story. This is a real story. The names have been changed for reasons that are obvious. And I refer to this story as collapsing under complexity. It's, as I say, it's a real story. It started about 4 years ago. A very large organisation in Europe was implementing purchase to pay, and they were using company A. I won't say which company they were using, which software they were using. And when they started their program, they specified about 20 important business requirements. It was quite a long list of business requirements that were unique to them. And one of the reasons why they selected company A was that company A was able to customize the solution and adapt to the solution, configure the solution to meet these rather unusual business requirements that the company had. So that they signed up and began to implement, and it was a difficult project. After 2 years, it had become so difficult, they were so behind, there were so many problems, they abandoned the project. It was a complete failure. And instead, they went out to the market again, and they approached company B, another software provider of purchase-to-pay software. And again, they explained to company B the 20 special requirements. And company B said, we can't do any of them. In fact, we refuse to adapt our software. Our software represents current best practice. across many organizations, and if that's not good enough for you, then we can't implement it. And the company was persuaded, actually, perhaps they should take a vanilla solution, and they did so. And the project was very successful. And quickly, it was very successful. Now, I'm sure you can imagine that Company B claimed a great success. They were able to say that they were much better than Company A. You know, we kicked out Company A and we implemented successfully. That's what they would say. But they were wrong. And I'd like to explain why, because there's some very important lessons to be learned from this story. So what were the lessons learned? I think the first lesson learned is that really Company B's solution was no better than Company A's. It wasn't any better, it's just that the sales team were wiser. Company A, the mistake they made was the sales guy said yes to everything. Instead of saying no, you know, we can just implement best practice, they took on a very complicated project and it became so complicated it was impossible to implement. So it was wrong of Company B to say they were better than Company A. It was just that they were less compromising. And the other lesson to be learned, if you don't know this already, is that purchase to pay for indirect goods and services is really just a generic set of processes. Every company is more or less the same. When you implement purchase to pay, it's not like you're building a production line for your unique set of products. You know, if you're doing that, you absolutely have to customize your tools and your production line to meet your own specific requirements. If you have a production line for making bread, you can't take the production line from a company that's making office furniture and make bread with it. You can't do that. But with back office processes, for generic back office processes, you absolutely can. You can take best practice in another company, in another industry, and use it yourself. 99% of it will fit. There should be no need for certainly extensive customization. There is a need for some customization, of course. Laws are different in different countries, so there will be a need for some localization, but generally speaking, there should be no need for extensive customization. And organizations need to really think about what their real business requirements are. When I say real business requirements, I mean they can't simply say that what we do today is our business requirement. They have to understand why we do things the way we do, what's behind that, what do we really need, and I'll explain the difference between real and not real business requirements a little bit later. But I think it's that the example of Company A and Company B is a very good illustration of why it's not businesses implementing that need to learn lessons, vendors need to learn this lesson as well. They should be taking some responsibility in helping their clients think outside of the status quo box, to think about how to change, and take the lesson from Company B and perhaps sometimes be not so compromising in their sales approach. Now, most P2P solutions, most technology solutions, not just P2P, so CRM and the HR solutions are cloud-based today. And there are advantages and disadvantages. Some of the obvious advantages. If IT is not your core business, why do you want to build an IT empire inside your organization? It makes much more sense to have complicated things like IT outside of the business, and that's one of the fundamental benefits of cloud. It's also very flexible and scalable. If you double the size of your business, let's say through an acquisition, you can very easily just ramp up number of users in a cloud solution. You don't have to invest in hardware. There's no capital expense. Generally speaking, it depends on how it's priced, but it should give you much lower costs, particularly as you won't pay for what you use. There are disadvantages, of course. You lose control. You don't have the same control with a cloud solution as you do if you host your own software in-house, and you have your own IT team. A cloud solution can only really deal with generic capabilities because a cloud solution is providing the same service to many different organizations. You simply can't heavily customize these types of solutions. And although security fears are much less common than they used to be, there is still some concern that using a cloud solution could leave you vulnerable. But I think in summary, the point about cloud for P2P is cloud offers a great solution where you want generic best practice. For things like HR, for things like CRM and purchase to pay, it's absolutely ideal. Although customizations aren't possible, you need to question, do you need them? But that in itself can be turned to an advantage, the fact that customizations aren't possible. It can be seen as limiting, but it can be turned to your advantage. And I want to explain what I mean by that. The fact that you cannot change and heavily customize means that when you're implementing, you can present effectively a fait accompli to your audience. You can listen to their requirements and say, yes, we understand what you'd like, but we simply can't accommodate those changes. We have to do it the way the cloud solution offers. And that gives you a kind of an effective and polite way of saying no. So I want to, just build on that theme of turning challenges into opportunities. We need to recognize that incremental change can be the most difficult to manage. If you're going to say to people, we need to just change the way you do things just a little bit, it can be very difficult to argue the case for that. If people say, well, it's such a small change, why do we need to change? If instead you're presenting a fundamental change and say, you actually have to throw away everything that you ever knew and you must take on something else, it gives you a big strength. It allows people to work with a blank piece of paper, start thinking in fundamentals again. It's really important that you don't offer, this is particularly true in purchase to pay, but it's true about many change management situations. You must not give people a route back. You've got to burn the bridges. You take them on a journey, and when you get to the destination, you have to give no route back. Otherwise, people will simply revert to the way things used to be if they feel uncomfortable, instead of learning to live with the new world. When the world changes, fundamentally, you have to make fundamental changes. And I'm going to give some examples of this in a second, of very big changes that have forced significant changes in the way people behave, the way industries behave. I mentioned before, working from a clean sheet makes it possible to reinvent processes. This is quite important because people will always revert to what they know. And if they're forced to think about a completely new environment, they go back to basics in terms of thinking of new ways of doing things. And because change is much easier when you have no alternative. If you know that you've got to live in a new world, it's much easier to face the fact that change is inevitable rather than if it's kind of negotiable. So it is possible to turn some of the change management challenges into opportunities, sometimes making some of the changes even bigger and more fundamental than you might otherwise have felt comfortable with. Okay, now I want to give an example. I'll give a couple of examples of how the world changed fundamentally. And that the first example I want to give you is one about the IT industry. And many people know about how the IT industry evolved, but others won't, and they won't remember how very different the world used to be. So in the 1980s and early 1990s, when computers were becoming accessible to businesses and and to household. The way that you would buy a computer was you would buy it from a retailer. You would buy it from a computer dealer. And that computer dealer or that retailer would in turn buy the IT hardware from a distributor. And the distributor would hold stock on behalf of manufacturers. So you had several steps in the supply chain. You had a manufacturer, a distributor, a retailer, and then the consumer. And the way that worked from a financial point of view is that the manufacturer would supply the distributor. The distributor would supply the retailer, and they would be on normal sort of payment terms. They might be on 45-day terms, 90-day terms, something like that. And if you imagine the size of the IT industry and how many steps there are in the supply chain, and you add up all of those 90-day terms, you can see that from beginning to end, there's a long time before manufacturers were actually being paid compared to the time that the consumer was buying the product. And there was also an awful lot of inventory being held. That was the whole point of a distributor. They would have the warehouses and they would hold all of this inventory. That comes at an enormous cost. Similarly, the retailer would, generally speaking, have things hold a certain level of stock. So there was a huge amount tied up in the supply chain of the IT industry, both in terms of delayed payment terms and management of inventory. And then along came, in the mid-90s, along came a company called Dell. And Dell are the most well-known. They weren't quite unique, but they really do take the credit for pioneering this. The thing that they did differently is they used the internet to sell directly to customers. And again, this is well known, but the change it made to the industry is absolutely huge. So they were able to offer a service whereby customers could order a computer directly over the internet and buy directly from a manufacturer. But what they also did is they didn't actually manufacture the computer until the customer asked for a computer. So they didn't even have to buy the components before they actually had an order. And they would charge the customer up front. So one of the things, the two fundamental things that Dell did is, first of all, they completely disintermediated the IT supply chain. Distributors and retailers were kept out of the picture completely. That allowed them to reduce prices very, very significantly. And secondly, they turned the financial supply chain completely on its head. Dell was charging up front before they even manufactured things, so they didn't have to hold stock. Now, there was no way the old IT manufacturers could ever survive in competition with an organization like Dell because their cost base was fundamentally different. So there is an example of one very simple thing happening in the world, which was the development of the internet, fundamentally changing a whole industry. In fact, many industries completely changed, absolutely turned on their head. So I want to use that as an example of how significant change can be and why it's really important to recognize that change happens and how you have to confront it. The other more current example is Uber. I know there's a lot of controversy about Uber, and quite right too, because it's absolutely disrupted a whole industry. And it came about very unexpectedly. The Uber was a result of the convergence of three technologies. There was mobile telephony, the internet, and global positioning satellites. Once those three things are mature and accessible, it would be impossible for something like Uber not to emerge. It becomes absolutely compelling. And this represented a really significant change. One of the things that's very sad for the old taxi industry is they're very traditional, old-fashioned, don't like change, and they tried to resist the change until it became too late. And these are very important lessons for anyone dealing with change management, anyone facing change. Very small background changes, the introduction of new technology, for example, can force change that you absolutely cannot ignore. You absolutely must face change. I'll give you a third example, which is a change that hasn't happened yet, but I would predict that based on those two examples of the IT industry and the taxi industry, there's a very good chance that there'll be a very significant change of purchase to pay. If I ask you the question, what is an invoice? I think that there'll be lots of answers. Some people say it's a piece of paper. People say it's a document that records a business transaction. It could be described as a document that records tax information. And all these answers are all correct, of course. Other people might say, well, no, an invoice needn't be a piece of paper. It could be an electronic document. It could be a PDF file. Or it may even be something that isn't human readable. It could be an XML file. So when you think, well, fundamentally, what is an invoice? It's not a piece of paper. It's a record of a transaction. And I think it's very important that we remember this and don't think necessarily about what an invoice was traditionally. We have to think of fundamentally what it is. It's a record of various transactions. But there's a new technology that is emerging and gaining strength, and that's blockchain technology. And one of the important things about blockchain technology is it creates a single version of the truth. And in a world where you have a single version of the truth, documents like purchase orders and receipts can't be disputed. There's no need for an invoice to match these things before you know that something needs to be paid. And it could well be that in the future, because of the emergence of blockchain, that the concept of an invoice completely disappears. And if that's the case, that will fundamentally turn on its head how the back offices of most businesses run. The things that we accept today as being normal and standard and fundamental just won't exist. And the world of purchase to pay could change as fundamentally as the IT world did in the 1990s and as the taxi industry has changed in recent years. As we move to that new era, we need to be careful about the artifacts of a previous age that we want to retain. We don't necessarily want to retain, just as the IT industry might have wanted to retain distributors and retailers, there was no way that could happen. Similarly, as we move forward, the concept of invoices and some of the fundamentals of purchase to pay, we may have to discard. Okay, so what are the sort of changes that we confront, especially in purchase to pay? I would group them into two broad groups. I would say there are cultural changes and there are organizational changes. So examples of cultural changes are simple things like redesigning processes. The way things are done today is often the way things have always been done, the way people have always done them, the way people were taught, the only way that people know. And redesigning a process can be it's a cultural change. It's more than just a way of doing your job. It can have a significant impact. The way we do things could be led by convention or precedent. What do I mean by that? And this doesn't just apply to a buying organisation. This can include the way suppliers interact. So, for example, in the lawyers, for example, conventionally they don't accept purchase orders. They can, but they prefer not to. And it's the convention of that industry to take instructions and then invoice after the event. Sometimes there are just precedents for doing things. That's the way it's always been done, so why change it? These are all examples of cultural change challenges. And when it comes to asking people to change or asking people to redesign the way they do things, often they will answer, well, we don't know what we don't know. What they mean by that is, we don't know what's possible. We've only ever worked in this industry or in this company or in this department. I don't know how other people work. I don't know what's possible. It can be very difficult for people to think out of the status quo box and think about different ways of doing it. And then there's another very important cultural change that is very difficult to overcome. When asking people to change the way they do things, sometimes you will inadvertently be removing a perk. A very simple example of this. as part of a purchase-to-pay program or a procurement program, you may change the way travel is booked. And for someone who always likes to book their own travel using their favourite airline because they collect points, that can be a very significant perk removed from them. They know that it's hardly the crime of the century for people to go off policy in order to collect points. But it is important that people apply policy, and this can upset people. People need to realise, A, that those perks will be lost, but secondly, when you implement change, you have to be sensitive to the way people will feel when their perks are taken away. It's no good to say just to use the policy as a defence. If people are upset and unhappy, you'll have a very difficult program. So be sensitive to perks that are removed. Examples of organisational change. I mean, there can be very significant changes in a purchase-to-pay program. You could be fundamentally changing people's roles. If somebody spends 10% of their time dealing with requisitioning and buying, and that part of their role is taken away and put into a new department or is automated, for example, that could leave them with less things to do. They may feel upset at that. There may be a need for, when you implement purchase-to-pay, a need for new types of people, like operational procurement people, the kind of people that support the day-to-day purchasing activities. It's not, you can't just give people new roles, you need to put them within a management structure and a hierarchy, and that can be quite a significant change. And of course, there's an obvious change in that often accounts payable departments are resized. When you automate purchase-to-pay, you don't need as many manual processes, so you don't need as many people. So again, that's a very significant organisational change. Now, I mentioned before about thinking differently, and I've also mentioned that people don't know what they don't know. How do you get people to think differently, or why do people think differently? And I've just got an example I want to use to illustrate this. Let's say, for example, you're working with an organisation to implement purchase-to-pay, and you're gathering business requirements. And one of the business requirements is the CFO must sign all invoices valued at more than 100,000 euros. That would not be an unusual business requirement. The precedent is, historically, the CFO wants to see all of those invoices and sign it as a means of proving and saying that can be paid. That's a completely pragmatic thing to do, and in a paper world, that would be very common. But is that a business requirement? And I think you would need to argue strongly that that actually is not a business requirement. That's not the real requirement. The real requirement is for the CFO to approve expenditure of more than £100,000. The signature on a piece of paper isn't a requirement. That's just a convention of how the CFO has historically approved that kind of payment. Actually, so to express the requirement more exactly, the CFO must approve expenditure of more than 100,000. It's very different to the CFO needs to sign invoices. Purchase-to-pay, in a purchase-to-pay best practice world, no one ever approves invoices. You only approve purchase orders. Invoices are just matched to approved purchase orders. In a best practice world, the CFO should approve the purchase order for something valued at more than £100,000. But I can tell you from my own experience, even when it's implemented, many people, many senior people, like to see the invoices as well, because they simply don't trust the new system. It gives an example of the scale of the change management problem. When you try to get people to think differently, they have to think about fundamentals and what is a real requirement and what is not. Okay, I'd like to conclude before we go to any questions that we have, and just look at some top tips for dealing with change, managing change. The first I would say is listen, but don't negotiate. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, when it comes to change management, you're asking people to change either culturally or organisationally, but change absolutely affects people on a personal level. And it's very important that you listen to people. Why do you do that? You do that because, first of all, it's polite, and you're more likely to get people to change if they know that you've dealt with respect. But also, you have to check whether your assumptions are correct. Sometimes you think that your purchase to pay policy and your software will fit somebody's circumstances, but you actually might be wrong. When you get to understand their job, maybe what they do is an exception. So you do have to listen. However, listening is not the same as negotiating. You need to go into a conversation about change management and purchase to pay on the basis of how, not if. How are we going to affect this change? Not asking, are we going to affect this change? So absolutely listen, but don't see that conversation as a negotiation. Secondly, respect people. I mentioned that respecting, listening. That's not the only reason to listen. You do have to respect people because, as I say, change affects people on a very personal level. I mentioned the example of people going off policy to collect points for their favourite airline. That's non-trivial to say to people, we're going to stop you collecting points. That could be very upsetting. They could take it personally. If you're going to change somebody's role, change the job that they've been doing for years, again, that will affect them on a personal level. If you're going to tell people that you're putting controls in place to minimise fraud, make sure that you don't sound as though you're saying you don't trust people. So, you know, people they're real people. You know, they will feel the change and they could be hurt by the change. So absolutely be sensitive to those things. Number 3, learn the difference between real objections and false objections. Now, I'll explain a little bit like this. So when somebody says, oh, we can't possibly do that because of something, that's an example of an objection. And sometimes people will say, we can't possibly do that because they just don't want to change. Sometimes they say, we can't possibly do that because they know something you don't know, and it's true. Now, most of the time, the objections that people put up, they may be sincerely held, but they're not real objections. But you have to be very careful how you deal with them. So even though 9 out of 10 objections are false, you mustn't treat them all as being false. The example I like to give with real groups of people about recognizing the difference between a real objection and a false objection is I like to give people an egg. So if you're in a meeting with 10 people, I have 10 eggs. 9 of them have been hard boiled and 1 of them hasn't been boiled. And I'll give everybody an egg. And I'll say to them, I would like you to crack that egg on your head. So 9 people crack the egg on their head and they come to know, oh, it's been hard boiled. But one person, and you don't know who it is going to get egg on their face. And this is a very good example of what happens if you don't know the difference between real objections and false objections. You have to treat them all as potentially real, even though you know 9 times out of 10 it will be false. And you need to learn the difference. Because if you treat them all as false, you'll get egg in your face. Number 4, segment your organisation. What do I mean by this? You can, broadly speaking, you can divide an organisation into 3 groups of people when it comes to change. There are those who will embrace change, people who like change, people who enjoy taking on the challenges of the future and so on. And they're your allies. They will be the super users of the system. You can use them to help others to come on board and to change. So they're very important people to get close to and stay close to. The second group is those who fear change. fear of change is a very natural thing, and it's to be expected. And people often fear change because they don't really understand the true implications of the change. Again, you have to be very close to these people, be sensitive to them, support them, understand their objections, knowing which are false and which are real, and bring them along with you. This group of people require quite a lot of work, and most of the change management effort will be directed to them. And then there's a third group of people. There are those people who will undermine change. You need to get rid of those people. That may sound blunt, but you need to move them. You need to move them out of the department, out of the organisation, fire them if necessary. You absolutely cannot deal with an important change programme faced with people who are deliberately trying to undermine change. You cannot compromise on this. You either have to get them into the group that fears change but is not going to undermine it, or you have to get rid of them. There's no two ways about that. Number 5 is be flexible. You know what you're going to implement. You've bought some software, you've written a policy, you're implementing best practice, but you don't know everything. And it may be that you confront things you didn't understand and you have to change. It may be that some external force happens, there's a change in the law, and you have to change. You have to change your approach. You must be flexible. If you're inflexible, you will appear short-sighted and people will begin to not trust you. So it's important to be able to adapt your approach. And the final one, number 6, is communicate, communicate, communicate. Everyone says this. Communication is the most important thing. Don't have any secrets. Don't have any surprises. Tell people what's going to happen. But very importantly, tell the truth. Now you may say, well, of course we tell the truth, but no, that's not the case. Sometimes people say the world is going to be better. Some people say your life is going to be easier, when it's not. Some people will say your jobs will be safe. They're not. It's really important. Once you get caught exaggerating in the wrong direction or concealing things or deliberately not telling the truth, no one will believe anything you say. It's really important. Even if the message is a difficult message, you must tell the truth. And that's the most important lesson of all. Okay, so that concludes the main portion of the presentation. I hope you got something out of that. I wonder if, Ashika, have we had any questions?
Yes, Pete. We have one question. The question is, how do you deal with a senior person or executive that refuses to change?
Oh, okay. Yes, this is this is important. I think we've talked in previous webinars actually about implementing purchase to pay bottom up or top down, and which is the best way to, which is the best approach to take. And often a mistake that's made is to implement purchase to pay from the bottom. When I say the bottom, I mean individual users. You train them to buy things, and then you start to move up through the organisation, through to the approvers and managers, senior managers and executives. And you come to a point, sometimes at the executive level, where people say, actually, this purchase to pay stuff doesn't really affect me. This is my budget. You can't tell me how to spend it. I'll do things my way. Thank you very much. And that can be quite difficult, particularly if the person you're trying to change is more senior than you. And that's why it's really important to get a mandate from the top. If you're asking people more senior than you to change the way they do things, and you don't have a mandate from their boss, from the CEO, for example, that's a very difficult conversation to have. In reality, the reason why senior people don't like to change is they have the same fear of change as anyone else. They don't like to see perks taken away from them. They don't like to lose control or be told what to do. However, once they realise the reasons why purchase to pay is being implemented, they are good corporate citizens, they wouldn't be in the job that they are if they weren't. And once they can see the good reasons for this, why it will save the company money, why it will make it safer, well, they'll be able to set a good example to other people. Why it's generally in the corporate goods, they will generally be persuaded. There are very few, especially senior people, that will fly in the face of common sense and not be good corporate citizens. So how do you deal with senior people? One is treat them with respect like everyone else, but explain the fundamental reasons why this is a good idea. And secondly, make sure you have a mandate from their boss so that you don't have to negotiate anything, you can just implement.
Okay, Pete, we have one more question. It's can you talk a little bit more about how blockchain technologies will affect P2P?
Yes, okay. So let's just to explain. So in the current world, whether we're in a paper-based world or in a digital world, the way purchase to pay works is like this. You have a purchase order which you send to a supplier. The supplier makes a record of that purchase order. They'll record that in their sales system. So you have two documents, purchase order and a sales record. Then you have the supplier delivers goods, and they have a delivery note, and the buyer might have a goods receipt note. Again, you have two documents that record the same event. And then you have an invoice, and the supplier sends an invoice to the buyer. And then again, you have two records. You have the invoice that the customer has, and there's a copy that the supplier has. When there is a three-way match done, if there's no match, there's some kind of discrepancy between the invoice, the receipt, and the purchase order. And that can happen for all kinds of reasons. So an example why there might be a mismatch is, let's say the supplier has added on delivery. So the invoice will have a line for delivery, but the purchase order never did that. So you immediately have this mismatch of data. And that's why we have accounts payable departments who look at these matters and resolve these kinds of discrepancies. Now, if you think about what could happen in a blockchain world, in a blockchain world, you have a shared ledger, whether you're recording financial transactions using Bitcoin or you want to record purchase to pay transactions. Instead of having multiple different records, you might have one record, which is held in blockchain. So there's only one record of the purchase order or the request for goods. There's only one version of that. There's only one version of the delivery note. And there's only one version of the invoice. But when you think about it, the invoice is really just a duplicate of the information that's contained within the purchase order and the receipting document. The invoice just says, these goods were ordered at this price, they were delivered, therefore you have to pay a certain amount. Well, in a blockchain world, there's no need for that document because you could use a smart contract, which is hosted on the blockchain, that says the moment goods are delivered and everyone agrees, there's only one version of the truth with blockchain. The supplier knows they delivered the stuff, the customer knows they received it, and it matches with the purchase order, because it would, because there's only one version of the truth. Then why do you even need an invoice? There's no need for that. The record that proves the payment is required is contained within the blockchain already. So you just have a payment initiated. And of course, if you were going to use a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, you wouldn't need a bank either. So that's a view of how blockchain could change the world of purchase to pay. And if you compare it with the examples I gave of Uber or the IT industry, blockchain could fundamentally change the way supply chains are managed. Absolutely, in a fundamental way. There will be no need for auditors. There will be no need for accounts payable functions. There would be some very, very significant changes in the way the back office is run. This is not going to happen overnight. I mean, today an invoice is a legal document. You can't just change international law, but it has the potential to change things very significantly indeed.
Okay. All right. I would, like to thank you, Pete, for conducting this webinar, as I would also like to thank all our attendees who have joined us today. Thank you so much. And you can always email us your questions if you have any, and we shall send back the answers. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.